Hey everyone, welcome to Church Online. We are so glad that you could join us today. My name is Megan and I'm a pastor on staff here, and I have the privilege of hosting the service today. For those of you that don't know, we are one church in 3 locations. So if you're ever able to join us in person, we would love for you to check out one of our campuses in Westland, Milwaukee, or Beaverton. In the meantime, we'd love to meet you and help you get connected. The best way to do that is to click on one of the links below or check out our website. Our mission as a church is to inspire people to know, love, and follow Jesus. We absolutely love our local communities and want to do whatever we can to help make a difference in the world as we learn what it means to follow Jesus together. I hope you'll find today's message challenging and encouraging, so let's lean in and engage.
Well, good morning. Thank you for joining us at Beaverton Christian Church. Now, we're deep in our summer series called The Greatest Stories Rarely Told. And it's a series that highlights 3 godly values essential to the mission of Jesus. And it's how we do church here at BCC. Now, last week, we talked about sacrificial generosity. But this month, we're moving into radical hospitality. And in August, we'll focus on uncommon humility. Now, we're examining these 3 values by looking at Bible stories you might not be very familiar with. These rarely told stories demonstrate how godly character and Christ-filled responses transform us. And then they allow us to partner with God as He transforms the world around us. Now, you might be wondering what hospitality has to do with being a follower of Jesus. And it's probably because the word isn't used much outside of our modern hospitality industry. In the hospitality industry, travelers have their needs for housing, meals, transportation, and recreation met by employees who earn a living by making them comfortable as they journey. And we all know that hospitality is more than just providing a service for money. Modern hospitality has evolved over time from the ancient art of receiving strangers into your home, making them welcome, protecting them, anticipating their needs, and providing for them until they could safely resume their journey. Now, in the ancient world, travel was incredibly dangerous. People risked their lives in the elements for long stretches of time. As civilization was developing, people gathered in places where there was water, and they built fortified cities around the water source. Travelers then leapfrogged from one fortified water source to another for survival. If you couldn't make it to a city by nightfall, things got treacherous. See, outside the walls of a city, people were likely to encounter armed bandits. Your best option were the farms and ranches of the large families who lived outside the city. They lived in homes, even to this day, that are built very close together in the foothills, because the hills were natural defenses against marauders on horseback. And large families brought strength in numbers. Travelers who encountered danger outside of cities would have to seek refuge in these homes. So customs developed for how you demonstrated care for people in need and how you honor and respect your host. Now, in the ancient world, hospitality was always the privilege of the host. Even when the host was poor, they owned the home, and all of their resources were on hand. The traveler was limited to the money they had with them, and ATMs didn't exist. So since the homeowner was in a position of economic strength, they had the upper hand. It was their duty to serve. Now, because the guest was in the weaker position, they shouldn't ask for anything, only receive what was offered with thanks. Beggars couldn't be choosers. From the moment the guest entered, it was the responsibility of the homeowner to protect the entire party and anticipate their needs, freely offering whatever was needed. To make them ask for help was to shame them. Water for bathing, wine for drinking, food and beds, these were the bare minimum to be offered. Now, emergency requests could be made, but not directly from the guest to the host. Special requests were made through the servants. And this prevented a no answer from bringing shame to the host or the guest. Keeping these customs maintained the honor of the host and preserved the dignity of the guest. We see some of these ancient dynamics at play, in the Portland airport even. Because the shops at the Portland airport have the upper hand, the city passed a law requiring airport prices to be the same as Portland prices. There's no $60 egg salad sandwiches. I'm looking directly at you, LaGuardia. It's hospitality, but it's business hospitality. Now, I just recently discovered that there's an airport that has a totally different kind of hospitality. And it's the kind that will make you want to fly east for a 24-hour layover, even if you're just headed here in Portland to Boise. It's in Seoul, Korea. Incheon Airport isn't crafted with the airlines in mind. It's crafted with the traveler in mind. It's beautiful, and there's plenty of shops that never close. And because they understand that long layovers happen when you're crossing the Pacific Ocean, they even have movie theaters and an ice skating rink. If you need to sleep, you don't have to go Tom Hanks on the floor. They have designated quiet areas and nap zones. They've got comfortable beds, no armrests, and they even have those big massage chairs. And you know what? Those massage chairs are free. They've got shower facilities that are free, so you can freshen up before your next flight. Now, I haven't even gotten to the good part yet. See, they're so grateful for the support of the international community that helped establish their independence and preserve their freedoms, that the Transit Authority gives international travelers free guided bus tours of the city. You see, if you have your passport and a plane ticket, they'll send you out of the airport on a 3 or 5 hour bus tour of the city with a guide who speaks your language. They load your carry-on bags under the bus and they take you to at least 3 incredible locations. The first stop is the most beautiful palace in all of Korea. And while you're there, you can stroll through the gardens and watch the changing of the guard. Now, after this, they load everybody back into the bus and drive you over to the Jogye Temple, where the courtyard is decorated with hundreds of colorful lanterns under the shade of a 450-year-old pagoda tree. Now, you might be thinking, but what if I'm hungry and my body clock is all messed up? I mean, do I want steak dinner or do I want breakfast or maybe just a simple salad or something? Well, Korea has a meal that's all of those things called bibimbap. And your next stop they take you is to the Insadong Street Market, one of the oldest shopping districts in all of Seoul. And the street is lined with antique shops, tea houses, art galleries, and restaurants. And everyone in your group gets to sit together at a long wooden table, and bibimbap is the entree. It's a traditional mixed rice bowl with sauteed vegetables, chili sauce, slices of grilled beef, and a fried egg. See, because they want to honor and care for the people who are visiting them, it's all free. You just tip the bus driver at the end to show your gratitude. They're not just being polite or friendly. This is radical hospitality that's meant to help you want to get to know South Korea, no matter how far away you've come from. So for the next 4 weeks, we'll be looking at how hospitality is commanded by God. And it's an essential part of a vibrant faith that brings hope to people, no matter how far they've traveled from him. Jesus' close friend Peter says it like this in 1 Peter 4, 9 and 10. He says, "Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace in its various forms." Today's rarely told story comes from the Old Testament. Now, about 900 years before Jesus was born, the people in Israel suffered a civil war, and their nation was split into 2 kingdoms, an agricultural kingdom here in the north and a mountainous kingdom in the south. The temple of God was in Jerusalem here in the southern kingdom. And in the northern kingdom, the leaders resented this, and they began encouraging the people to worship foreign gods. To show his people that he still cared for them, God sent them traveling prophets to minister in their towns and villages. And these men and women, they spoke out against the corruption in the northern kingdom, and they performed miraculous signs and wonders among the people. These signs and wonders weren't superpowers that they possessed like Superman or the Flash. They were demonstrations of God's power through them. Their miracles proved that they were God's servants, sent in God's name under God's power, and they were signaling to the people that they should return to God. And one of these prophets, named Elisha, performed a vast array of miracles. And one of the greatest was a moment when he ministered to a woman whose only son had just died. Today, we're looking at a portion of the story that rarely gets told. It's the part before the miracle. And in it, we see how hospitality transforms strangers. It knits them together into powerful and hope-filled relationships. So we'll start in 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 8. It says, "One day, Elisha went to the town of Shunem. A wealthy woman lived there, and she urged him to come to her home for a meal. After that, whenever he passed that way, he would stop there for something to eat." So Shunem was a small farming village in the valley south of Mount Carmel. It still exists to this day. This picture was taken of Shunem from the foothills above it. And you can see that it's become a fairly modern city. But in this picture from the early 1900s, you can see that the people were still living in square homes that were constructed from cut stones and mortared with mud. Now, Mount Carmel was where Elisha lived, and it's where he led a school of young people that he was training to be prophets. And whenever he traveled from Mount Carmel to the south, he needed places to stay. And this woman would show him hospitality. Now, in the original Hebrew text, the Bible tells us that she was a great woman. This means more than just wealthy. She held a position of significance in her community. She was powerful among her people. She invited Elisha in to share a meal. Now, in the ancient world, you could provide food for your guests, but you didn't have to eat with them if they were below your social class. To eat with them signaled that you were interested in them and open to a relationship. Providing food was the standard, but breaking bread together, that was the invitation to begin something more. And we see that their friendship grows because after that first meeting, Elisha began to come by whenever he passed through. What happened once became a regular occurrence. Hospitality begins as a social engagement, but it progresses from just a social grace to a relational opportunity. You can go ahead and pause that, get out a pen and write that down. You can even go back, right? It goes from a one-time thing of social grace to an opportunity for relationship. Now, this transition from charity to hospitality, it's only possible when we begin thinking of others, not in terms of charity, but hospitality. You see, with charity, we say, stay over there and I will help you. But hospitality says, come here and let me know you. Charity looks down on suffering from a position of strength, but hospitality opens the door for interdependence. And this is so important for us to understand because people, they've got important physical needs, but our most profound need is always relational. This is why Jesus didn't just shout some things down that we needed to know from heaven, but he came in the flesh to know and be known. He desires more than just obedience. He wants relationship. Now, when Christians live hospitable lives, we don't just walk around spouting principles at people. We take the time to get to know them, to understand their story, to hear their pain. And when we understand that pain and they understand our care, that's when we introduce them to Jesus. Now, since we never know when these opportunities will arrive, we have to prepare our hearts to be open to spontaneous hospitality. See, we have to ask God to open our hearts to the needs of others so that we won't make excuses when the opportunity arises. Now in 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 9 and 10, it says, she told her husband, I'm sure this man who stops in from time to time is a holy man of God. Let's build a small room for him on the roof and furnish it with a bed, a table, a chair, and a lamp. Then he will have a place to stay whenever he comes by. See, it tells us she made a place for him to stay, an addition up on her roof. Remember those square houses? Well, they built them square so you could easily add on rooms to the sides or up on the roof. And as their relationship grew, she was making appropriate room in her life for him. When we invite people into our lives, we have to be considerate of what the appropriate place is for them. See, she's a married woman, so she made a place at her house, on her house, but not in her house. She was maintaining appropriate distance for their friendship. Husbands and wives have to be considerate of each other in their relationships. Everyone needs to be comfortable with hospitality arrangements, especially at the beginning, so that there's a safe place for things to progress and grow too. This is so important for us to remember as we practice hospitality. If you are ministering to others, you still need time and space to be alone with your family and with God. We need to be ministered to as well as ministering. See, we meet needs sacrificially, but we don't lose sight of who is meeting our needs. Now, she made the place comfortable for him. When you invite people in, you're meeting them where they're at. You have to consider their needs and do what's best to meet those needs. It tells us that she outfitted the room with the kinds of things that a traveling teacher and diplomat would need. It also tells us that she set up a place for him to stay whenever he came by. She was setting up a system to accommodate him whenever, not just if it happened. See, we should always be ready to host people spontaneously, but then she goes the next step and demonstrated that truly hospitable people make plans for intentional hospitality. When we want to demonstrate radical hospitality, we organize and arrange things, beginning with time, to demonstrate we're anticipating someone's arrival and we are prepared to meet their needs. When they arrive, is there something for them to eat and drink? Is there toilet paper in the bathroom? Has the dog already been put in the garage? See, this story shows us that radical hospitality takes place when we are intentional about meeting others where they are and then offering them three very specific things. The first is appropriate place. The second is comfort, care-filled comfort, right? And the third is giving sacrificial time. Now, as we go through these next 4 weeks, we're going to see how people who surrender to God will demonstrate radical hospitality in order to see both individual lives and communities transformed by God's Spirit. We'll see that radical hospitality is the way that we say to others, you are loved, especially to the people God brings us. And we do it so they can ultimately hear him say, I love you. I died for you. As we dive deeper into this story, it's important for us to understand where radical hospitality leads us in relationships. It moves us from being proud hosts and gracious guests into deep and significant relationships of interdependence with each other. You see, Elisha had been dependent on her, but as the story progresses, we will see this great woman become desperately dependent on Elisha. In 2 Kings chapter 4, verses 11 through 13, it says, one day Elisha returned to Shunem, and he went up to this upper room to rest. He said to his servant Gehazi, tell the woman from Shunem I want to speak to her. And when she appeared, Elisha said to Gehazi, tell her, we appreciate the kind concern you have shown us. What can we do for you? Can we put in a good word for you to the king or to the commander of the army? No, she replied. My family takes good care of me. See, Elisha wants to respond to her hospitality with gratitude. We always respond to hospitality with gratitude. He wants to bless her in return. And I want you to notice in this verse, we see the ancient hospitality customs on display. They're speaking through intermediaries, so no one will be embarrassed by refusals. Elisha offers to arrange through his servant for extra protection, and she refuses. It's an honor she doesn't feel she needs. But Elisha wants to do something to show his thanks. So in verse 14, he presses in with his servant. It says, later Elisha asked Gehazi, what can we do for her? And Gehazi replied, she doesn't have a son, and her husband is an old man. Now, we've talked about this before, but it bears mentioning again. At this time in history, women weren't allowed to own land on their own. This isn't because people were trying to be repressive, but because the world was still savage outside of those fortified cities. Women living alone on a piece of fertile land became targets for exploitation. See, men were the labor and defense force of a homestead, and women ran the finances and the household. When the last man died, a childless woman had to sell her land and animals and property and move into the household of the closest relative, where she'd be safe. But it cost her everything. Gehazi was making it clear that the time for this was approaching this woman. So in 2 Kings 4, 15 and 16, Elisha says, call her back again. When the woman returned, Elisha said to her as she stood in the doorway, next year at this time, you will be holding a son in your arms. No, my Lord, she cried. O man of God, don't deceive me and get my hopes up like this. Elisha has his servant summon her, but then he speaks to her face to face. The social walls between them are gone, and he tells her that God will give her a son. This is about as tight as a friendship can get. And she responds by saying that she can't get her hopes up about what this would mean for her. Have you ever been in a situation like this where you want something so much, but the disappointment would hurt so bad that you won't even let yourself dream about it? Maybe it's a house, a new car, a spouse, a promotion, making the sports team, getting into your first choice college. You've been there. To want and be disappointed would be so heartbreaking and humiliating that you refuse to dream or even attempt if it means coming up empty. Well, for her, it's not the promise of success. It's the promise of new life through a son. Verse 17 tells us, but sure enough, the woman soon became pregnant. And at that time, the following year, she had a son, just as Elisha had said. Remember, the prophetic miracles were a sign of God's power and his care. And when a prophet performed a miracle, it increased the faith of everyone who saw it. I want you to notice that it says, just as Elisha had said. And this is super important because the Bible only had one test for whether or not a prophet spoke for God. And it was super simple. The prophecy had to come true. If your prophecy failed, nobody listened to you anymore because it was clear you didn't have a connection to God. Prophets that weren't batting 1,000 weren't prophets at all. Remember that the next time you're listening to someone who's got the future all figured out for you. The Bible tells us that the child grows, and one day while he's out in the field with his father, this child, this blessing from God, complains of a headache and suddenly dies. So they took the body up to Elisha's room. And his mother immediately set out to go get Elisha from Mount Carmel. And when Elisha saw her in the distance, he sent his servant out to meet her, but she brushed him off, saying, hey, everything is fine. But it wasn't. In 2 Kings 4:27, it says, but when she came to the man of God at the mountain, she fell to the ground before him and caught hold of his feet. Gehazi began to push her away, but the man of God said, leave her alone. She's deeply troubled, but the Lord has not told me what it is. This woman, this great woman, is now groveling at Elisha's feet. And Gehazi's immediate response was to stop this undignified behavior. It's his job to prevent relational shame and dishonor. But Elisha responded with compassion. Leave her alone. She's greatly troubled. Then he says this, God won't tell me. He's holding the information about why in reserve. Why in this moment would the prophet suddenly become so unprophetic? It's because God wants her to tell him. He wants her to take the risk of honesty and vulnerability, revealing her heart and asking for what she needs. See, the pain and the hardship of this loss is so great that humility and trust are her only options. Don't miss this. Humility and trust are always how we come to God. And this is one of the reasons that he allows suffering to come into our lives. Because without them, we will just stand on our pride, our self-confidence, and our resources. Remember that pride and self-confidence, these are the enemies of human vulnerability and intimacy. They create isolation from other people. It's always humility and trust that produce knowing and being known. Look at what she says next in verse 28. Then she said, "Did I ask you for a son, my Lord? And didn't I say, don't deceive me and get my hopes up?" She is pouring out her pain, and she says she didn't ask for this. See, when our confidence is in our greatness, our ability, or our resources, we might engage in charity to demonstrate our position of strength or superiority, but we'll never be able to engage in the kind of hospitality that produces long-term, faithful relationships. God calls us to hospitality with others because that's how he's going to humble us through relationships of interdependence. See, we can be prideful and charitable, but radical hospitality asks us to risk humility and vulnerability in order to build relationships of interdependence with one another and with God. This woman has a need that only God can meet, and only her friend can offer it. The Bible tells us that Elisha comes to her home and he performs this elaborate ritual involving prayer and his staff, and he's pacing around the room and he's touching the boy's eyes and his mouth, and slowly but surely over time, the warmth comes back to the boy's body. Now, this ritual doesn't make much sense to us today, and repeating it wouldn't bring anyone else back to life because the rituals of the prophets weren't a recipe for magic. The prophetic rituals were demonstrations of the prophet's dependence on God. The actions Elisha took demonstrated that he was hearing the voice of God and he was obeying. The prayer demonstrated who he served, who his authority was from. The ritual demonstration that God performed the miracle through Elisha, not Elisha on his own. And with the boy alive, it tells us in verse 36, then Elisha summoned Gehazi. "Call the child's mother," he said. And when she came in, Elisha said, "Here, take your son." She fell at his feet and bowed before him, overwhelmed with gratitude. And then she took her son in her arms and carried him downstairs. This new close relationship is on display. And as a result of her relationship with God and Elisha, her son was resurrected and her hope for the future was restored. This story is a small Old Testament picture of all that is to come in the New Testament when God's son Jesus is resurrected, and anyone who places their trust in him is given the hope of a future with God for all eternity. And those people who give their lives to Jesus, true believers in Jesus Christ, we engage in the ritual of hospitality to invite others into the new life of faith that we've found in Jesus. And today, we are called to hospitality because it opens the door to deep relationships that draw everyone closer to Jesus. So today, I want you to, in your heart, be open to spontaneous hospitality. When opportunities for hospitality present themselves, it's not that our hearts don't recognize them. We're regularly seeing people in need. Maybe they just moved into the neighborhood or they're walking into our church for the very first time, and our hearts go out to them. But it's our mind that shouts down our heart. It tells us we're too busy or we're not prepared enough to investigate others. If we don't recognize this, we will let our minds shut down what God is moving in our hearts to do. Today, purpose in your heart to act when you see someone you can reach out to. Remember, hospitality can be as simple as making room in your morning to introduce yourself to someone and to learn their name. We also have to make plans for intentional hospitality. See, when you are willing to be hospitable to people in passing, God will prompt you to make room in your life for more. He will move you to make and perform plans to invite others into your life. Setting aside your time and your resources and offering an invitation is how deep and interdependent relationships are born. So pick a morning for coffee or an evening for dinner and reach out. It's an act of faith that God will meet you in. And He will use it to grow you in humility and trust. Lastly, respond to hospitality with gratitude. This is as simple as it gets. When someone is hospitable, return in kind. Be gracious and thankful. Growing in relationship is the result of hospitality. So let the hospitality of others shape you to become a grace-filled and thankful person who looks forward to paying their hospitality forward. Will you pray with me? God, we are so grateful to you for reaching out to us in need, for taking us in, for protecting us, for meeting our needs, God. God, for creating safe places for us to pour out our hearts in vulnerability, to ask you for what we need, and the friends you bring into our life to provide them. God, I pray that you would help each of us to look for ways to participate with you in that. Help us to open our eyes for spontaneous hospitality. God, to make plans. Maybe that's joining a hospitality team at church or starting something in our neighborhoods to reach out to others who need community. God, I pray that you would help us to humble ourselves and respond with grace and thankfulness to any hospitality that comes our way. In Jesus' name, amen. Hey, I want you to know that at beaverton.cc, we have a website filled with resources, ways that you can get connected, ways that you can find out what's going on. We would love for you to check it out there.